This video response is going to go out to Mike Winger, and that's because you posted a video entitled "Why Jesus Cursed the Fig Tree and Flipped Out in the Temple." Okay, in this particular case, it's not the information that you have in your video that's such the big concern. It's some of the information that I did not see in your video. And because that information was not in your video, I'm going to go ahead and give it here. But before I do, I wanted to let everybody know, if you're not Mike Winger and you're watching this right now, if you do not know how to read messages from the community tab on your smartphone, there is a hyperlink down here below that has a video that will show you how to do that. Furthermore, I know this particular video does not have a YouTube card, but many of my other videos do, and there are lots of other channels that have these cards on their YouTube videos. If you do not know how to see these YouTube cards on your smartphone, there's a hyperlink to one of my videos that shows you how to see those cards, okay? So anyway, without further ado, let's go on. I'm going to give you this information which I did not find on your video. Okay? Obviously, Jesus knew that the fig tree wasn't ready to provide any food for him. But was this just as obvious to the disciples? Well, let's find out. You and I both know that at least 7 of the disciples came from an advanced agrarian society. 2 came from Galilee, 3 came from Bethsaida, and if I mispronounce that, I apologize in advance. And another one is, and 2 of those disciples came from Cana, and if I mispronounce that, I apologize again. But what about Matthew? He came from Jerusalem, but he was also a tax collector. It is very likely that Matthew collected taxes from farmers or people that participate in this agricultural industry, even if they were just the owners of the land and then didn't necessarily plant the crops themselves. So it is very likely that Matthew knew some things about agriculture, including when things would grow and when things wouldn't. Otherwise, he couldn't collect taxes on crops or land. Now, anyone who knows this would know immediately that that fig tree had a deeper meaning for the disciples. Once you know that particular piece of information, anybody that's reading the book of Mark would know instantaneously that this story had a deeper meaning. Okay, it wasn't about agriculture per se. All right. So is it possible to discover this deeper meaning? Personally, I think William R. Herzog II has discovered this deeper meaning. He discussed it in his book entitled Jesus, Justice, and the Reign of God. So what details did he provide in his book? Well, here's the book right here. Okay? And I'm going to be referencing chapters 5 and 6 of this book. If you want to read it for yourself, you are more than welcome to do so. Okay? In chapters 5 and 6 of his book, which I just showed you, he determines that wealth in the first century was equated with land ownership. The Bible seems to verify this. A careful examination of Leviticus chapter 25, okay, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23, would make this point very clear. Now, Mr. Herzog mentions and actually points out that only 2% of the population, and he says Palestine, it would be not only Judea, but all the territories that Herod Antipas owned as well. 2% of those territories, okay, 2% of the population of those territories owned all that land. Only 2% of the people that lived in that land owned it all. Okay? All right. How was this achieved? According to Mr. Herzog, the prosbul, and he mentions this quite frequently, was one of the tools, I'm sure it wasn't the only one, but it was one of the major tools used to achieve this control. I mentioned the word prosbul in one of my previous responses to you, and I was surprised you didn't bring it up in this particular presentation, but Oh well. Anyway. Did Matthew the tax collector know about the Promise Bowl? It is very likely that he did. But what does all this have to do with the fig tree? Well, we'll get to that, because there's a lot of details to cover on top of this. First, let me state that Jesus didn't just calmly walk up to the fig tree and say what he said. He didn't say, hey, you know what, guys, check out this fig tree, da-da-da-da. He probably walked up to the fig tree, he held the leaves, he examined the tree very carefully, so on and so forth. And here's the reason why. Okay? He was using the fig tree as an illustration. Why would he do that? Both he and his disciples at that moment were well aware that Jesus was very soon going to be facing imminent peril. We all know what that peril was. So it was important for Jesus. It was important to Jesus that the disciples remember the lesson he was teaching them. This required a mnemonic device. In other words, the mnemonic device. It's hard to say this word. The mnemonic devices used by Jesus throughout the entire four Gospels are similar to the ones used by Harry Lorraine in his book entitled The Memory Book. And I have mentioned this to you twice before, but here it is. This is something I actually teach on my YouTube channel, something that so far I have never seen you mention on any of your videos. Okay? Mr. Herzog also said that anything that wasn't controlled by Herod Antipas was controlled by the high priests and elders. Okay, Herod Antipas and his constituents, okay, remember that 2% of the population? They controlled a certain territory. This would have covered Nazareth and all the area around Nazareth. Okay, now when we're talking about Jerusalem and all of its outlying areas, that was controlled by the high priests and elders. It was also controlled by Pilate. Of course, I'm referring to who controlled Jerusalem and its surrounding community. As a matter of fact, 22 of the high priests in the time of Herod the Great came from the following Judean families. And if I mispronounce any of these, I apologize in advance. Boethus, Ananas, Phiabi, and Kamith. Now, just so you guys will know what this is all about, in this particular video, I know I'm doing a live stream right now, but in the real video that you're probably watching right now, I'm going to leave those names right down here in the description below so everybody can look them up. Okay? They not only controlled the Sanhedrin, or Sanhedrin, which depends on how you want to pronounce it, and the temple treasury, which a lot of people don't know. At this particular point in the video, I'm going to offer a side note to my students because I know some of them have actually read this book and they need a vocabulary lesson real quick. Alright. The definition of the word usufruct, and I'll leave that word down here too in the description below, it literally means the right of a particular person to use the profit of somebody else. This concept will play an important role in this particular discussion. Remember, in an advanced agrarian society, a farmer wasn't just able to grow enough crops to feed his own family, he was able to grow extra crops to barter with his neighbors. This disturbed the Sanhedrin at the temple. Okay? Now, another couple of details that I think will also fit into this discussion is that when we're talking about when Solomon finished the first temple, okay, he taxed the Jewish citizens heavily and used forced labor to finish the building of the temple. Another thing that I didn't hear in your presentation is that Solomon owed Hiram, which was the king of Tyre at that time, a very large debt. So Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in Galilee, according to 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 10 through 14. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned that according to Leviticus, God would oppose giving or selling land. God also established a connection between land and the Torah, which is 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 6 through 7. So why were the money changers so important to the Jewish population in the time of Jesus? First, many Jews didn't actually live in Jerusalem. As we know, they lived in Nazareth. We already know the story of how Jesus, Mary, and Joseph traveled all the way from Nazareth to Jerusalem through Bethlehem. We know that story, okay? I would imagine it was the Passover, if I remember right. If I don't, you can correct me, but I'm pretty sure it was the Passover, that's why they went. Okay? And if I'm wrong, fine. Alright, anyway. Well, I know they went for the census. If I'm wrong about that, you can let me know. And if I'm wrong, I'm apologizing now. Okay. Anyway, let's go on. So they had to travel to Jerusalem to make their sacrifices. Often it was impractical for them to bring their sacrifices with them. We're talking about 1-year-old male lambs. Really, you're going to bring that dang thing all the way from Nazareth to Jerusalem for their sacrifices? I don't think so. So they had to purchase their sacrifices from the money changers. Also, if you remember the parable of the coin, Roman currency wasn't permitted in the temple. So these travelers would have to exchange their Roman currency, which was inscribed with pagan symbols, for Jewish currency that could be used to buy temple sacrifices. So was Jesus opposed to the main purpose of the money changers? Well, if you read the parable of the coin, obviously not, because he paid his, remember the parable of the coin clearly established. I didn't think he was really opposed to it. And I think he would have bought his temple sacrifices himself with the parable of the coin. See, he certainly hadn't brought anything with him. Okay? According to Mr. Herzog, there is no rabbinical proof that the money changers were fleecing the Jewish travelers. If you have particular proof of this, I'm willing to listen to your argument. But what about the outer court? Jesus never indicated that he was about to usher in the final age of existence, as was prophesied by Zechariah chapter 14, verse 20, or Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. So this provides further proof that Jesus wasn't directly criticizing the current sacrificial system or the priests directly for that particular purpose. After all, Jesus himself offered sacrifices to the temple every year of his adult life. So do we know if the money changers were located in the outer court of the temple? Well, I might be able to offer some proof on that. First, we have to actually read what Josephus said about the temple. If you go to Josephus and read Antiquities chapter 15, and I guess it's verses 410 through 420, you will see a description of Herod's rebuilt temple. But you have to go to the Mishnah to find an additional detail that I think confirms that the money changers were conducting business at the outer court. And I have left a link to that in the description down here below. They gathered pledges from the Levites and Israelites and freed slaves, but not slaves or women or minors. Now that meant that all those people were in the outer court. Okay. Otherwise, that would mean something a little higher up. Okay? Since the outer court was the only place slaves, women, and minors could gather, then the money changers had to be located in the outer court of the temple. Now you say, well, there was a point where Jewish women could still gather, but that would have been all women. It was just Jewish women. Okay, if you're talking about the Gentile women, all they could do is gather in the outer court. And you know that, and so do I. And we all know that slaves never made it much past the outer court. Okay? And we know that the minors didn't go up past the outer court either. Alright. Unless, of course, they went with their mothers up to the court of the women. I don't know if they did that or not, but I don't think so. And even if that, they would have had to have been Jewish children. They wouldn't have been Gentile children. There's no mention of whether they were Jewish or Gentile. So, anyway. Mr. Herzog states that there is no proof that the outer court was called the court of the Gentiles during the time of Jesus, or that the Gentiles actually were praying to the Holy One of Israel at that time in the outer court. Maybe they were back home, I don't know, but there's no solid evidence that says the Gentiles were specifically going to the outer court of the Gentiles to pray to God Himself. No proof of that whatsoever. According to Mr. Herzog, that is. If you got proof, I'm all ears, but you're going to have to prove that one. So what was Jesus really objecting to? Well, let's find out. It was a well-known fact that the Jewish people at that time relied on God's good graces for good crops and for healing as well. But what if they were in debt to the temple, which a lot of them were? Their debt kept them from receiving God's good graces, according to them. The high priests and the Sanhedrin, they knew this. And it is my personal belief, and it seems to be somewhat confirmed by Mr. Herzog himself, that they were using things like the Prose Bowl, to keep unwanted Jews from accessing God's good graces. Remember, when God healed the paralytic, He didn't just heal him of his disease. He also restored him to normal society. Okay? Because a lot of times Jesus wouldn't just heal an infirmity of a person, but would also forgive their sins. Which meant they had access to God once again, and they were getting access to God without having to go through the temple and doing all the temple taxes. That's what ticked off the Sanhedrin or whatever you want to call it. Okay? And I personally believe that's the reason why Jesus was overturning the tables of the money changers. Now, if you want to refute any of this, be my guest. I'd love to see your refutation. But before you do, make sure you read chapters 5 and 6 of this book. Then we'll see. Alright. I want to thank you very much for watching this particular presentation. I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.